We now invite all the speakers to join the roundtable discussion. It will be moderated by Doc, you can call her Doc, who is the assistant teacher and postdoc and researcher at the theory department in Karlsruhe here at the university. And please welcome all together.
Okay, I would like to start right now. If somebody has a question, please raise it. For the time being, probably I will louder.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
If somebody has a question, please let me know. And in the time being, I will start with some questions for breaking the ice. Probably first with Chrissy. Yeah. You talked about this destabilization that happened between the values and the mask that you work out in your projects. One thing that I just wondered, can you make it a little bit clearer how this relationship or this process that really going on in your design process, in particular for the Detroit project? I think that one should be a pretty clear one.
Okay. I think for the Detroit project, there were sort of two scales that we were working with in terms of negotiating volume. One was working with an existing building, which on one hand is incredibly massive, but actually had the volume in its interior was very minimized in terms of having kind of a minimal floor-to-floor height, as it was kind of a distribution center. So the idea of kind of going into that building and negotiating its external mass and reworking how its internal volumes work. The kind of shearing of that mass, I think, was really important in that negotiation, so that when new volumes were inserted into that building, they very much read as volumes from the neighborhood, or as you would approach the building. I couldn't talk about it in detail, but it's you can approach that building from like 1.5 miles away. And so as you get closer to it, they change from being kind of objects that poke out and above the existing mass and kind of glow and have a very different transparency or opacity than the building itself. As you get closer, such as across the street, you would begin to be able to kind of see through a building that previously was kind of opaque and incredibly massive. So I think in that way, we were working with kind of volume in terms of containing space and breaking up spaces in different ways within that building, but also working with how volume could kind of expose itself on the exterior. So I think that's maybe the way in that project, way that volume was trying to be both inside and outside at the same time.
And this is for you, it's even like trigger the relationship with trigger the idea of civic space
Civic space?
or this concept, the relationship with the neighborhoods.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is something I didn't talk about so much, but volume obviously, I think most often is associated with an interior, right? It's containing and enclosing space in kind of you could fill it with water kind of way. But I think it's interesting when we if you start a project by designing the volume inside, if you move that outside, it starts to be about designing kind of outdoor rooms or things that we call plazas, porticos, and these types of things. So of course they're not volumes in the same way. Like if you pour water into the site on the back, it's gonna go into the Detroit River. But the idea that you would design kind of the spaces between buildings, and even within the inside and outside of singular buildings, with as much robustness as you would design the mass itself. I think creates opportunities for what you call civic space, or what I would sometimes just call outdoor rooms, to get us to think of those outdoor spaces as things that can have walls, and they don't have ceilings per se, but I think there's a certain sensibility of enclosure that you can work with as a designer, to think about how, when you're outside, there are certainly different gradients of how much you feel like you're a part of a building's presence, or you're released from that presence into kind of a true state of non-enclosure.
Can I ask a question? I was interested to hear a little bit about your design process, maybe a little bit from the kind of direction that we were bringing up of the vocabulary of a design process. And one of the most amazing examples I've come across, which not related to your work specifically, but the way that the fake skies are done in places like the Venetian Mall in Las Vegas. They're completely their own vocabulary for you to talk to each other while they're creating these things. And it just seems like to me that your design process is very specific and peculiar, and it would be interesting to hear a bit how that works. I mean, how you talk to your team and to your partner with all of these projects.
I guess I would say, I didn't, again, 20 minutes is a really short amount of time, so I didn't appreciate the question about process, and I also appreciate that you guys showed student work. I think one way that I kind of explore these outdoor spaces and outdoor rooms in a way that helps me to think about them in a more kind of architectural and interior way is do a lot of seminars on the idea of volume, and having students kind of model only the volume of a project as opposed to the massing. So that's really easy to understand if you would give someone the Pantheon, for example, and you ask the student to sort of just model the interior surface that creates the closure, and then begin to look at that and evaluate that as an object, which I think as architects and even as students, we're much more familiar doing. So it gets us to understand, like, oh, that's something we can really design, as opposed to it being the result of the kind of massing. And so another way is to have them look at buildings that I think have kind of excessive volumetric outdoor rooms, so something like the Hirshhorn building in Washington, D.C. by Gordon Bunshaft, where the sort of interior surface of that donut is way more, the way it has openings and apertures, that interior courtyard feels much more like a room, an interior room, than kind of anything within that building itself. So in that case, I would have students kind of build the volume that kind of seeps out underneath the donut and goes up into a column. And the student then begins to make judgments about, well, where would I stop that seeping out of volumes? I liked, I think, Vera yesterday talking about this sort of leaking container. She meant it in a different way, but I think in terms of volumes, and particularly when it refers to kind of outdoor rooms and kind of how do you enclose it in terms of sky, or how far your gaze. I like that you guys talked about gaze. So I guess the way we do it, and I talk to the students and then my team, is that we look at other projects that I think do that quite well, even though that may not have been their initial intention.
Do you ever look at streets? Because they are basically what you're describing, even though we are so used to perceive them as just a street, but you can start to see them as such, like the volume in between buildings, and they are everywhere, right? And different typologies can create different conditions or different experiences, but also like different detailing on facades can change the room that the street can be perceived as.
Definitely. Another workshop that I did was specifically looking at the outdoor rooms. It was I was invited to Skopje in Macedonia, where the entire workshop was just having students kind of go around and model exterior spaces between buildings. So very much like Camille Cite's work on the plaza, and yeah, that was really interesting to begin to think about looking at the streets and the facades of buildings as kind of the surface treatment.
Wallpaper.
Exactly. No. Yeah. Definitely. So I've definitely worked with that, which is good.
But for other speakers as well, because I think the common aspect among this session is that all of them work and teach all together, and I just want to know how deep the relationship between your teaching activities and your design practice. How it intertwine, or how it supports each other, or how do you design the proportions, the way it works, like a mechanism to produce your own design process, or how this kind of relation really work. Probably you can start with Sandra first.
Thanks. Well, it's a kind of a question I was just thinking how to really answer it, because I always sort of think of it as essentially 2 full-time jobs, which is kind of becoming a little bit more and more difficult to manage. But in principle, I mean, I started doing it, I guess, I mean, I know, it's sort of like a long, sort of convoluted question, but somehow, when I was practicing first, I felt like I was missing something, and especially dealing with contractors all day long, you sort of miss some kind of other dimension, right? So then I started teaching, and I kind of found it, and then I just started teaching and kind of didn't do any practice. I realized I was missing some other dimension too, which is kind of the implementation of what you're dealing with. So I started to do both. I mean, I can't say that it's necessarily a direct relationship, although we do, actually, we finally, I was able to convince the kind of management at Cornell that we should really run at least a couple of studios that deal with the kind of end user experience of a building. So whether it's let's say, quote unquote, real client, or some kind of interaction with the kind of the other side, because otherwise, at least on the kind of academic end of things, it's a very sort of insular thing, especially, like in a kind of studio situation. So we ended up with this kind of series of studios called Design Plan, as opposed to Master Plan, right? Again, as a critique of it, sort of more sort of bottom-up situation where there were kind of a series of, I wouldn't even say clients, but kind of people with problems that we try to kind of address some of their issues. But then, of course, we try to even do a design-build kind of situation, but then in academic settings, it's really nearly impossible, at least for us, because the curriculum and the academic schedule is pretty tight. So we kind of ended up in this kind of sort of halfway sort of consultancy situation. So that's sort of as close as I came to be able to fuse practice and the kind of academia as these kind of sort of hybrid studios that sort of deal with the real world to some degree, at least with some kind of other outside input, but don't necessarily sort of take it all the way to the point of construction. We can end up with maybe delivering some kind of documents that whoever uses them can use them for fundraising and kind of further. And, so anyway, so that's kind of a long answer to a short question. So, sorry.
With Camille, because with the works that you did in Bangkok, I think it's really complicated, and for me, because it's really stunning for several things that you did in Bangkok, because you use you play between the idea of this animism and science, the control, the authority of a certain profession, and the way we think about that, and this spirit that you always feel in Bangkok with animism, superstition, and also. So how you start, how do you communicate or do this idea with your troupe or your teams and produce and arrive to the output? I mean, because you play with a lot of abstract idea that put it all together, and how does it work, the whole process?
So I would say it's always depending on the situation and the place where we are and the people that are involved, but the general thing is that we would start with an idea or a story that we want to address in the paper. And then the process really simply was to work in teams. So in a way, in the same way you would make a film with like different departments, some for writing scenarios, some for making a story board, some for designing the prop and then constructing it, team for filming, and each team from the very, so most of this project were made in months, everything, including construction, not the editing though, I was doing that after, the editing of the film. But within a month you really have to be efficient, and so actually we didn't do any teaching in the sense of analyzing things or studying, which you would, I guess, normally do at schools on some design events, but really it was about producing from the very beginning and learning through this production. But so the challenge also was to be, like, for students or for even ourselves, not to be too close into one category and then spending 1 month just writing a scenario, which would be maybe a bit boring, but you still have to give a lot of yourself. So you still have to spend time and dedicate yourself to it, but we would also, of course, have bridges between the groups that could, inform each other, and then presentations. And also everyone was taking part in the construction at some point.
Hey, it's a question for Laura and Fred. I just, something I was wondering, like when you were presenting, amazing presentations, but when you approach design from the angle of the experience and from the user, it's really interesting to see, like, looking with the students to understand using VR sort of exactly where the eye lands and sort of how people start to visually respond to architecture, and that's great. But I guess, and it's a question obviously I wonder about a lot as well, is when you want to design something for a specific reaction, and that's your design intent, the experiential aspect of it. To really understand how people are going to respond, you have to work on quite an abstract level. Yes, okay, the eye goes to something which moves a lot, has a bright colour. On that very sort of simple level, you can understand how people respond. But the moment you start to add the stuff which I really love in your work, for instance, which is the ornament, the references, the kind of transformation of historical elements and elements from geographically diverse locations in one place. The response there is much, it's secondary, it's not on the physical level. That's more when people are thinking, it's more of an intellectual response. And that, I think that's almost impossible, or it seems to me that potentially that's impossible to predict. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on that secondary aspect of your work, which I think is much, much richer and much more than that very simple abstract level where people go, oh, it's warm or it's cold or it's busy.
I see your point, and I must say that we design differently than what we praise to our students. Like, obviously, because they are different, right? I mean, that's where the difference lies. I mean, we're trying to communicate to students, it's like, look, not everything is going to come out of psychoanalysis, or not everything is going to be based on the context, or not everything is going to be problem solving when you go out. Like, you better have an intent. And the students, they work with maybe a relatively simple or like approachable experiences that then they try to build around, and with that they realize and they learn that, like, oh well, wow, what I am designing, what this thing is, it's actually providing something that people is going to experience. So it's a very simple way of getting them to learn that and to have the experience of designing like that. So then, like, whatever you're going to design, yes, it's going to resolve some problems, but it's also going to provide an experience. So what we want is to make them fully aware that that is going to be there always, no matter what. Then when we are designing, obviously after doing it many times, I mean, we are interested in a myriad of other things that we haven't really been able to map. In such simple categories. So it is actually quite different. I mean, we are interested in those like few points that we try to summarize, like the effect of intricacy, even though we may not analyze the effect of each particular bit of content, but all together. And then the content comes from, like, literally what we have to offer at this moment in time. So I guess from that sense it's different than, or the way we design actual volumes, right? We do it a lot based on volumes that we have experienced, and then based on what you know those can produce, you use them to your advantage, basically. But then, yeah, obviously, then the mapping of what that has created is so much more complex. Although the aim is to be able to get better at it and to actually be able to understand, predict to a certain extent what is the effect that at least at a general level of how we all perceive space. That part could be to some extent predicted.
Can I ask a follow-up question? I'm just curious, like, how do you guys deal with like the questions of that? Like, where do happy accidents fall into your in the book? I'm thinking of actually of your project for the Bremen that kind of ended up being as a temple to the devil, by accident. So, like, if that happened to you, like, how would that be a success or failure, or something else entirely?
That's a very interesting question, and I was going to, based on what Lara was saying, also link to Camille's work and what Lara said. Obviously, like any young practice, we're just kind of trying things out and finding things out as we go. And in many cases, the results are happy accidents, even if we maybe present them otherwise. But linking to the way that we teach, and Adam's point about many of these things being very, very simplified ideas, is maybe linked to, even if the projects we do in our practice turns out to be kind of very idiosyncratic and kind of all over the place, and happy accidents, one might say. With this kind of idea of thinking, of being in control of your vocabulary and the linguistic understanding of what you're trying to do, I think comes a slight ambition even in our work, and it manifests in our students' work of I don't think we would ever be able to work the way that Camille works, for instance, which I greatly admire. And maybe for me it comes from spending a year with Oliver de Meissen, a unit at the AA dealing with ornamentation, where literally knowing each word for each piece of a classical building is the link to being able to design like that. And I realized, like, I didn't know any of these words, and now I do, and I can think like that, which then results in a kind of thinking process that then it must mean that mystification should be eradicated from my design process. Like any kind of level of place where I don't know, we don't know how to operate, should be found out. If something is mystical, it's there to be processed and discovered and understood. And I think maybe linking to Adam's question with the students' ideas being like, this project is about awe, this project is about leading the eye around the room, is partially an experiment, maybe a bit selfishly from our point of like, how far can you go really with 1 year of trying to understand visual beauty and pleasure in a room, not through intricacy, not through variation, but through leading the eye on a chase. Very, very, very simple, and with the aim of there being no mystification, no happy accidents when that is done. Basically, a full understanding. That sounds a bit absurd, but basically that's a kind of ambition.
Yeah, I would have a question for Lara and Frederick as well. I think the colorfulness of your work, especially in these 2D prints you showed, reminds a lot on psychedelic ideas also coming from the 60s. So my question would be, do you consider the psychedelic capacity of the users as well? And how far are you experimenting in this area on the effect what the user then have, being like seeing the colors, the ornament, the structure, etc.
Interesting observation, and very personal, I guess. And maybe we come from it at a different angle. And we recently took part in a symposium on VR, very directly virtual reality, and it was so interesting because we are very, very interested in considering a future, not talking about any technical aspects and about wearing furniture on your head and whatever, but the possibility of literally inhabiting the space while you're creating it. Like you're inside the space, and the moment you have an idea to create something, it's there. And that obviously links to a psychedelic experience where
You're creating.
not so, I wouldn't say things are enhanced, but your thinking process is different and things might visualize to you as fast as you can think. And it was interesting in this conference because we were literally talking in a very similar way that they did it in Harvard in the 50s, where like half of the room had not tried VR and the other half had tried it. And it was this great divide of this kind of big leap, let's say. So, and I wouldn't make any, I don't know, direct like kind of links between colors and intricacy and psychedelic experiences, because we live in a time where all of these psychedelics, a lot of them has been rediscovered, and the West haven't really been using these hardcore psychedelics since the discovery of LSD, etc. And it's also the time of modernism. So you look at all periods of history before, and you have intricacies and variations that are much greater than anything that we can achieve, at least now. So I wouldn't say that it's kind of directly linked on a personal level.
But, I mean, we understand you might see the aesthetic link, obviously, but funnily enough, we see a relationship to that, or a link to that, in our understanding of the potential of virtual reality, and how, hopefully, if there is not too much fear of it, or within the architecture community, like people really start being scared of virtual reality, and like there will be no place for architects. So what we're trying to do is to establish this bridge where really, as an architect, beyond being technically trained, you are supposed to be really good at designing spatial experiences. That's going to be needed like every second. Like there's going to be so much need for that in a very, very near future, where like virtual reality will be a new place for architecture. So if there is no fear for that, and we don't get another winter of exploring experiences, then hopefully we can jump into it, and then it will become incredibly interesting, because when we are in virtual reality, we will probably begin by relating, or like making experiences that are very close to reality, because those are actually the most powerful at the moment, because you understand how you're meant to experience them. But probably very quickly it will begin to depart from that. And then what are we going to be referencing? I mean, it's going to be so exciting. Like we are going to create a new world with new references that trigger experiences and reactions from us that are completely constructed virtually in a world that doesn't have to deal with gravity, doesn't have to deal with it being cold or warm, or like so many other things I want to imagine. Right? So in there we actually see the link. Of course you can make the aesthetic link with the colors, and I love that, I don't mind. But, sorry.
I would just say something to the VR thing, in case the question is going in another direction, which is to say, yesterday we stumbled upon a conversation that I think is similar in our teaching, and that you mentioned it today, in that a big part of I think my own design work, and certainly how I'm teaching students, is to build a vocabulary of interior spatial qualities, right? So like you said, if there's a complex interior, in the last decade, it's Pyreneesian. Right? I mean, it's like there's not the subtleties in vocabulary of the difference between like a niche and a coffer, and these things, which on one hand are sort of like a historical way of talking about surfaces, but they also, when translated into kind of a contemporary way, they have very different depths. They have different relationships to one another. One is meant to kind of pull your eye into it, the other is meant to pull you into it. Like these things that, and I guess related to the kind of VR, not necessarily on drugs, but I often teach my courses where we'll go to a city, let's say Chicago, because I was based in the Midwest for a while, and we would do an entire day where we would only, instead of going around and looking at buildings, we would only look at interiors. So we would move from one Sullivan atrium to Helmut Janzi, like we would just move from atrium to atrium, look at it from the bottom, the middle, the top, and I would ask them to sort of describe what it is that they're seeing, like just the using vocabulary that we don't usually use. And then I'm also working in the VR realm, which is to say, when you're when students go first time into VR and you ask them to make a volume, right? You are now inside, so you are making a space. The first thing they do is a sphere, right? Which is like totally amazing based on like the orthogonal nature of architecture. But actually, I'm like, well, then you get 20 people going in there thinking they're going to do this amazing volumetric interior, and they all come out with like, you know, this kind of circular volume. So then we'll say, well, what about if you would make spiky coffers or something? So we'll like throw vocabulary at them when they're in there, and now all of a sudden they start to look up and they're like, you know, and they start to do these things. Or like what happens if you like, you know, smear niches or something, and they're like, you know, they start to be like really weird.
Which is also a result of
if they were on drugs, that would be like probably amazing.
But that is also the result of the tools that are available now to model in VR.
Exactly.
Like there is this one main software which is actually like you're pouring this solid clay tube with brush, which then that's like painting lines. So there are others now that if you start throwing volumes, and that's a completely different thing. It's really changing a lot the way we think about spaces.
Just a question of coming out of curiosity, because we have actually Christy talking about volume, and we have you kind of flattening the losing interest in a way in space, perhaps because you have a strategy to highlight the virtual reality and what you actually want to suggest in the world. But I'm very curious to know, do you have any craving for volume, so as architect, or completely not? Or what's your...
I think actually most of it is maybe coincidence, because in Young Practice, most of the work we do is kind of smaller scale things, like the installations and things that are up for a day, and this installation up for a few months, and with the we've kind of quite recently discovered an interest in this, whereas all of our failed competitions from the past couple of years are all more dealing with volumes. And the first project that we showed, this Pantheon, is all about volume, and actually has a lot of links. We haven't really explored it, but I think that the projet, which is another kind of big vocabulary gap, I have no other words to basically describe that quality, but it was all about volume. So I think, to answer, definitely and absolutely, we're very, very interested in that. We want to build. We want to build big, and we want to do it in ways where the experience is really based on large interior, large volumes, basically. Be the interior or exterior.
It's not at all a lack of interest in volume. It's just an increased interest in surface. As in, like, because there's so amazing volumes being done in the past 10, 15 years, right? That were mostly white, which I understand, because then you're producing a form that we cannot read or understand, and then we constantly create this homogeneous, usually white, or with homogeneous treatment surface. But if that layer it's also containing content, then you're multiplying the possibilities, right? Then the experience is explodes.
I feel that in the virtual reality kind of frame of your activity, in my opinion, you're very explorative. You're really kind of pushing it. And if I think of the first project you show as a kind of volume, it's more kind of quotational, playing with the familiar, making it less familiar, or bringing new elements into it. But it's more kind of quotational, whereas virtual reality, you're really going there kind of forcefully and
I think we are running out of time, so we're going to go for the last question. And
Does your answer?
Sorry.
No. I think actually in working with a virtual, we would see a screen as being virtual. It's a bit confusing talking about this term VR. Actually, we would see a painting as being virtual reality, and a cave painting. So I think in the specific type we're talking about now, which is an embodied digital simulation, we do representation use it representationally for clients and things like this also, and explore all sorts of things. But there is this new realm which was brought up, which is literally that you can create things as you're in there, you're painting, and obviously then, actually in the pieces that we've done that are more exploratory, it's kind of all quotational also, and referential.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess you mean that the way it is arranged is less familiar with the projects that deal with virtual reality, and I guess because you feel still this fear of like, or not fear, but like you maybe don't dare when you are really intending to build it, and that like if this is going to be seen as absolutely impossible, like I wouldn't know how to physically build achieve some of the things that now we achieve in flattened versions or in VR versions. So I guess it's just very like a practicality. If we could, oh my god, like then we would go for it. But not to say that the other competition projects that we've done that we're holding back, but you have in your mind the development of a construction system. So I wouldn't know how to resolve it, therefore I don't design it as such. So because as we mentioned in those, designing building systems is also crucial for us when we are designing for building in the physical world. So I guess that's where it comes from. That is just basically our knowledge, applying our knowledge of how to build things.
You don't collaborate with engineers.
Not yet, we could afford them.
We will do it for free.
Okay, I think I'll go for the last question.
I can make it into a comment.
Okay.
So we can do the questioning in the lunch break. Yeah, thank you all for your wonderful presentations. And I think what you all have in common is you focusing on showing us how to perceive different aspects and qualities of architecture in your design and in your research. And what I'm trying to hitting it, and I'm picking up what you said, Frederick, on demystifying the architectural design process, is that all of you showed what your references are, and that's a wonderful thing for theorists to see. Okay, what is it actually what designers and architects are dealing with, but. The question of history and all your references, but what I find really interesting is how you deal with the question of the medium. So not necessarily that of a building, but different visual aspects, spatial aspects, and you incorporate that into videos, but also research and temporal buildings. So. This would be the common, but if you want to have a question is how you are experiencing your design process or research in regards to the medium. Do you find different aesthetic qualities in particular mediums such as video or installations, and how would this feed back into questions of aesthetics in general?
Do you address the question?
To everyone or no one?
Yep. Okay. Addressing media. Do you hear me? Addressing media in architecture is it means getting out of the box, getting out of thinking about things in material way, in physical way, and starting to get the relationship between material and immaterial. So what I've been doing in this process is thinking about moving through space and how we can construct our path of moving. How can we think about recording space, representing, visualizing it later in our architectural designs. Therefore, I'm trying to get out of what we think when we try to make realizations through the form, to the typology, aesthetics, and technology. No, I say no, we can deal with other things. We can start thinking about how we materialize our experience of viewing films. So for that reason, I addressed some theoretical references from the 60s, some video works, and I also addressed some first films from the beginning of the 20th century, which gave me some input to the ways the filmmakers try to organize space and events in space. So what I'm trying to do is to distance my design approach and education in architecture from the direct formal thinking, formal, typological, aesthetical in traditional way. I'm trying to act conceptually, as I said, which means I find a lot of theoretical inputs from the beginning of the 20th century wrong and one-way streets, for example. Because they, when trying to express movement, they try to do it in such a way to just ignore all the experiences that we have in space and directly translate some effects into dynamics, for example, or express our potential experience. But that is not how we feel. All of us, we are persons, so we act in accordance to a particular situation, and that is what how to say that? Situationists, yeah, sorry. Situationists of the 60s, they try to address these questions. So unlimiting the architecture through the temporarily form, through the sequences, and try to project the feelings in a way. So, but there are many theoretical inputs in a way. It would need half an hour to
Can budget be considered a medium? Sometimes it's really helpful to have a really tiny budget.
It's time for our lunch break, and thank you very much for all the speakers and fantastic to have you. So now let's go for lunch.